All right, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started then. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's In the Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross, the Curatorial Manager of Exhibitions and Emerging Artists Program at MoAD. And it's my pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with Oakland-based photographer and former emerging artist, EAP artist, Chanell Stone. Before we get to the conversation, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. First off, for all of the audience members, either on Zoom or Facebook, if you could drop in the chat where you're joining us from, that would be great. MoAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists at the African Diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard, join MoAD staff members like myself as we visit with some of our favorite artists in their studio to see what they're currently working on and how their work is changing as a result of quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios. We will follow all talks with an audience Q&A, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box at any point throughout the talk today. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up. You can also go back and watch all of our previous talks on the MoAD YouTube channel. This series was made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, our wonderful MoAD members, and viewers like you. Thank you all for your continued support. MoAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and so many others who have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We also like to give a land acknowledgement. Most of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MoAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this series or any MoAD programming, please consider donating to MoAD online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured artist, Chanell Stone. Chanell Stone is an artist living and working in Oakland, California. Stone earned her BFA in photography from the California College of the Arts in 2019 and has exhibited in galleries in San Francisco and New York. Her solo exhibition, Natura Negra, appeared at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco in 2019-2020. And she was a shortlisted finalist for the 2020 San Francisco Artadia Award. W Magazine listed Stone as one of 8 young photographers to follow in 2020, and in 2019, her work was included in the Aperture Summer Open. Stone's work belongs to several public and private collections, including the Center for Photography at Woodstock and KADIST Foundation, San Francisco and Paris. Through self-portraiture, collage, and poetry, Stone investigates the Black body's intersectional states of being and connection to the natural world.
Thanks.
So Chanell, it's quite an impressive bio.
Thank you.
It's really good to see you and to be talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. Happy to be here.
It seems obviously, this time last year, your show was up and exhibited, installed in person at the museum. And it's weird to kind of be doing this now virtually. I feel like we were just preparing for your artist reception at the end of February, the beginning of March, and now 1 year later, the world looks very, very different. I guess a good question to kind of kick things off with is just what has the last year been like for you since the show and just kind of dealing with being an artist during this very strange time?
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, I would say, since this time last year when my show closed on March 1st. And on the last day of the show, I had an artist talk in the space. And that was the last time I did a gathering like that with like a mass amount of people in that way. And it was a panel style artist talk where we just like discussed the work, but like broader themes surrounding the work. And it was a really great way to culminate the whole show. And it was exciting. And then things kept going. It felt like there was this momentum. And then all of a sudden we get hit with like COVID right before, I don't know, so many things seemed like they went on a quick pause. So what happened for me during that time was kind of unexpected. I had been laid off from work And I was working part-time. The other half of my time, I was invested in my art practice. So just navigating that tightrope of like keeping afloat and keeping my practice going. So when I was laid off, things just changed dramatically. It was like kind of like fight or flight mode. Like, what am I gonna do? Rent was still due in March, even though,
Unfortunately.
yeah, even though people were laid off, like right in the middle of the month. It was just bad timing. And I wondered if I would even be able to stay in the Bay, things like that. And it turned into me just kind of like reaching out to the community, to be real, online with reaching out to folks for help. Like literally, it's like I have nothing to give you in exchange. Like I literally just need help. And folks actually came to my aid, which I was so generous for. Just everyone that I had met, even folks that I had met at the show throughout MoAD, like the time that it was there, people I met maybe once, like they were so generous. And all of those donations just sort of like added up, and I was able to use that to buy food, to keep my rent going, until the situation with COVID kind of like we had an understanding where it's like resources like perhaps unemployment or things like that. But in the dead of it, I want to say through like March through like May, that was like just a nightmare. I thought it was over too with art. I was like, well, it seems like we're hitting a standstill. Like, you know, priorities are shifted. But surprisingly, once I got some stability from like community support, I noticed art wasn't going anywhere. There was so many things happening on Zoom. There were so many mutual aid funds and like grassroots projects to like support artists. And I feel like in 2020, like I became a grant writer. That's all I did. I was applying for, yeah, just left and right. That was my job. So my practice, I was definitely not the artist just pumping out a bunch of work during COVID because I was trying to survive. Like, I didn't have much to rely on by my own means. So, like, I was very much so just grant writing and reaching out to the community, like I said. And then after that, opportunities started to appear. Folks started reaching out to show my work or be a part of this thing, or do you want to speak here or do this? And I was really fortunate for that, really grateful. And I was able to do that. And it seemed like a momentum was picking up again. And then I shifted gears. Before COVID, I was working part-time in food service, as a lot of artists do. It's just like a day job.
Right.
I shifted gears to do teaching. I became an educator and teaching online through Zoom. I feel like during COVID, the playing field just got leveled in so many ways where the barriers to entry just weren't there anymore. So I was able to teach something I didn't feel like, I don't know, ready to do at one point, but I just went for it. Like I always joke and say like, it only took a pandemic to like take certain leaps, right? But nonetheless, that happened. And then that's what I kept saying, like things just kept like, it was a domino effect after that. And yeah, it hasn't really slowed down. I would only say the beginning it slowed, and then the rest it just kept going.
So it sounds like, in terms of your practice, you know, as you're saying, the way you looked at your practice and the way your practice kind of what it entails shifted from a strictly making perspective to now being you're now really invested in kind of in teaching and public speaking in certain ways. How has teaching, if at all, like changed the way you look at your own work?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It's changed it completely. Like personally, I see myself as a natural teacher. So when I shifted into that, it's working with youth, like youth of color in particular. And my work is very invested in Blackness and like just what does it mean to be a POC body navigating this world. So to give back to like youth of color and teach them like, hey, like art is a viable career and you can do this and you could express yourself and bring to light certain issues that folks just aren't aware of. So that was rewarding because one thing that happened as a result of the exhibition at MoAD was a lot of classes did tours of that show.
Yeah, we had so many tours.
Yeah, like some of the teenagers like reached out to me online or like your show really touched me. It was so this and that, just like this positive feedback. So like to give that back full circle through teaching directly, that was really rewarding. And it just helped me really investigate the medium in a different way that maybe I hadn't considered before. Because now you're instructing folks on it. So just just very full body. That's what I would say. Very holistic. Like it just really adds this other component to just how I make and like navigate.
Well, I also want to say congratulations for being the first inaugural artist being hosted through the Black Space residency at Minnesota Street Project. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of your studio practice there, what it's been like to be in residence there, and just kind of your time with the resident. Have you done many residencies before this?
I did one before this on Real Time and Space in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this came to be top of January, and it's continuing to the end of this month. Definitely just amazing. Like the resources available through that residency, phenomenal. Just I got to basically explore, and it's happening currently, an interdisciplinary practice. I feel like more so the core of my work had been photo based, but I had the opportunity to try some other things that I hadn't done before, like working with clay and just having access to that. That's something I've been enjoying. Just a different way of making. Like I feel like photo, I'm very much so like seeing the world in a way. This is like making with my hands, like just from scratch. So that's been awesome, as well as getting back into darkroom printing. That's something I have been craving to do for so long, and just that that's right there available. Just amazing. So that's what I've been doing. It's just really experimenting with other things I've wanted to try but never had access to try them.
Yeah. Are there any projects in particular that you are working on right now during the residency, or that you're contemplating or thinking about trying out?
Working with collage. So I've been reusing photos from my familial archive and just repurposing those images to create new stacked layered meaning. So I've been doing that, working with my archive. That's something that kind of started in 2020 also, just looking back, like what is it that I've accumulated either from a familial archive or my own personal artist archive, and blending the two together. So it's been less about making something new and just reworking. And I think it's really important to investigate the archive, like be it personal or familial, because everything that you make is just building off of something you've done in the past or something and like ancestral in the past. And I've been able to see these connections that I just hadn't looked at before, because I just felt like I was in a momentum of always moving forward, that I never really paused to look at what had been done. So this residency has been great with that, just recalibrating, looking at things holistically, and also rest. I just kind of let go of this idea of being a highly productive artist, like productivity, like my relationship to work has shifted due to COVID. And I feel like I protect that fiercely now. Just artists aren't machines. And, you know, sometimes the expectation is to keep making. And it's like, that's not how the process works. But now that it's like a year, almost a year since COVID started, I am more comfortable to get into the gears again. So that's why this residency has been great, just being able to do that.
Yeah, it seems like it's been a really contemplative kind of time for you, which is a luxury. It is a luxury in certain ways. That it's unfortunate that a pandemic is kind of what forced us to realize how much how sacred rest really is in this way. But it is also important that we're finally taking advantage of it as well.
Yeah, I feel like reading is something that I also picked up too. During the top of COVID and into now, I've been reading Toni Morrison. I started reading James Baldwin. And I recently got this book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which is really just literally having that time to slow down and just, you know, source information from other sources. And that's something I'm so appreciative of as well.
Apologies, I have a very needy cat at the moment. So I want to look at some of the work that you showed at MoAD and kind of talk a little bit through that series, and again, just kind of what your experience was like exhibiting it for the first time at the museum. So I'm going to share my screen. So this series, it kind of began it began kind of with your BFA work at CCA, right? And then just kind of expanded into this larger exhibition, this larger body of work and this larger project. And I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of the origin point of a lot of the ideas that kind of came to the fore in this series.
Yeah, so with this work, I was looking at, and I continue to look at the Black body's relationship to nature, but through an urban framework. That is partly based on my own upbringing. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I just grew up with a very pulled back, organized, gridded version of nature. Like that was the design of someone else versus just rural nature like that of Northern California. It's just a different context. And I started to look at what is my ancestral connection to the landscape, where is my family from, just searching for an origin point really and an understanding, and just looking at the different elements within this, like ideas of migration and statelessness. Like for the Black American, it's like home is really subjective, and the furthest thing we can get to it is going back to the American South. So like with this work, it's like looking at where I am right now, but traversing different cities because I haven't had the access to go back to the South to make the work. So it's like starting with where I am. That's sort of like a vision for it in the future, is to kind of like do this birthright trip back to the South where my grandparents are from. So in this work, it was photographed in LA, Oakland, and Brooklyn. Consequently, like each of these cities are undergoing gentrification at the same time, hasn't really slowed down since COVID started either. And just looking at my stake in these different environments and like how I interacted with these scenes and like connecting to the history and specifically the Black history in these cities, and using myself as a conduit to like tell these stories. It's a personal exploration, but it's also metaphorical. It's like I am a stand-in for something larger than me. And, like I said, these cities are going through gentrification and the Black presence is dwindling in each of them. So it's also this thing of like recognizing this Black woman, myself, like in the middle of the frame, like you have to see me, you have to reckon with my stance, my presence, the Black history in these spaces, all of those things.
With this image in particular, and you and I have talked about this before, obviously, but it feels so resonant of kind of the birth of Venus, this emergent figure in a way, and I guess that idea about the relationship to nature and renaturing in a sense. I love the idea of a return of sorts. It's both a birth, but it's also a return at the same time. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about I guess how you see the cyclical nature of your trips to, or your investigations of the South and of like Blackness within the American landscape and within American culture.
Yeah, it's definitely a reconciliation that's happening because my introduction into like the Black body's relationship to nature was through school, through K through 12, in a very limited, narrow, reductionist view of history, where it's literally, I remember vividly being scarred by that, like sitting in the classroom, and it started with slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, MLK, and that was it. It was just like this really limited view. And I was just like, there's so much missing here. And I didn't have the language when I was younger as a child, but it was like a conflict happening here. Like the homes of my grandmothers, their walls were filled with all these pictures of our ancestors from the South. And it's like, something's just not hitting here. It's like, okay, I'm seeing what's being taught at home indirectly through like what's in the house and then what school is saying. And it's just like, I felt ashamed at one point, just like, is that the history? Like the land was just a place of terror and death, and like we just escaped it eventually, and that was it. Like there's just so much more though, like especially with my grandmothers and their connections to gardening and just relationship to like herbs and various things. They're very connected to it. It's in our bloodline, it's in our family. And I just wanted to show that like it's more beneath the surface. And by returning back to that, it's like my family migrated to LA, leaving the South because of all of what was going on there during the Jim Crow South. So they kind of like left it behind. Some of them never went back. Some of them did to visit, but there was a disconnect. So through the work, it's like I'm reconciling like this generational disconnect that was happening in order to create like a healing. It's just like we're in a different space now. What ancestral knowledge in the land has been left behind, and what is left for us to discover? And just there's so much there. So like I said, I'm just looking at it from like where I'm at in the city, but it's kind of broader. It's more metaphorical, and it's also challenging the idea of what a landscape is,
Right.
especially being that Black people have systematically been barred from accessing like rural nature. I think about like the perception of who a national park is for, even,
Right.
and this idea of like maybe literal access. Like you just don't have a way to get to these places.
Even
So I was just like, why not strip it? Yeah, go ahead.
even urban nature, in a sense, the barring of, you know, how difficult it is, how few Black, especially people of a millennial generation, but also so much further back, how few people are able to buy homes within Oakland, within Los Angeles, to the ability to own a yard and what that means, and to have a tree of your own to tend to, a garden of your own to tend to. It's something that is very special when you do have it, and when, you know, someone in your family does have access to this kind of space and homemaking in a way. But it is still something that has been consistently denied us in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, and also this idea of a reverse migration that seems to be happening with a lot of people. I've been witnessing it within my peers, like you said, with millennials. A lot of people are moving back to the South, going to Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. It's this thing where, like, as we saw with COVID, I thought that was really interesting how this kind of heightens the message of my work a bit, where it's like returning into nature to get a sense of calm. That was all I saw during the very, like, the deep quarantine is what I call it, like that first half of getting adjusted to this new way of life. That's all we could do is maybe go for a walk somewhere in greenery, and like what that does to your mood to just be reconnected, be grounded. This is something I've been looking at prior to that, and it was great to see people doing that. And then, like I said, generationally, it's like I'm a second generation Californian. We're so stripped from that lineage in a way that it's like I just feel like it's something in me wanting to reconnect to that, especially what I was saying with COVID. Like we saw how the cities were like some of the worst places to be in during the thick of it. It's like the Bay was an epicenter, New York was an epicenter. Just the cities were not safe, and it's just this idea of like, where is safe? Oh, the areas that are less populated, somewhere like more rural, and just looking at like the failure of the American city, even, right? All of these things are like sub layers within the work that I'm interested in, peering deeper and like unpacking the layers of that.
Have you already begun to identify within the South the cities or the specific areas that you would like to return to, and as a means of expanding this body of work?
Yeah, retracing my own ancestral footprint in America. So my mother's side is from Texas, Louisiana, and like parts of Oklahoma. And then my dad's side is from Mississippi and Arkansas. So like starting off, I definitely want to go to Texas and Louisiana. I still have family in Texas, like very distant cousins and great aunts that are still living. So when it's safer, I definitely want to start there and then go into Louisiana, which appeals to me for so many reasons. And just look at how the landscape looks there within the city, within the actual rural state that it exists in there too. So yeah, that was on my mind. That's something I wanted to do last year, but we had to stay in place. It wasn't possible. So I'm hoping soon travel becomes safer to where I can do that. But definitely, it's retracing my own familial footprint in the American landscape.
I mean, with this work, obviously, it's incredibly beautiful and evocative in and of itself, but I don't think, until kind of this conversation, I don't think I really fully thought about how deeply intimate and deeply personal this series is. And so I wonder what that was like for you to present such personal work in your first kind of museum exhibition, to present it in this way. One, thank you, but then also, I guess, what was that experience like? How did your family react to the show, to the work?
Yeah, it was kind of nerve-wracking to be frank, only because my work is primarily self-portraits, so it's just me out there. Like
Mhm.
that's a whole other experience. It's like one thing to have your work, but then if it's you, there's this layer of vulnerability, and it's showing myself in different states and just putting it out there for those to soak in. So I think it was easier for me to accept public reception of the work. Like,
Mhm.
getting over those nerves. With my family, that was a whole different layer. Only because I'm the first in my family to pursue art in this way. It's
Mhm.
like I come from a family of artists, but we're working class people. Like, we just didn't have that luxury to do
Mhm.
it. They had family to take care of. It's just that wasn't in the scope. So for me to be doing this, it's kind of a bit of a lonely road to some degree, because it's like my family can only understand so much of what it is I'm doing.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of artists know this struggle. Like it's just one of those things at dinner, like in the holidays, like explaining what you're doing. It's just like, okay, it's just
Yeah.
so for the work to be in this space, it was so amazing. And I'm so incredibly grateful I was able to have this exhibition before the world got turned upside down, because my family was able to come up from SoCal and see the show. And they were just so amazed. They were so impressed. They were like, they told me, like, we knew you were doing something with photo, but like to see it in person just really put it together. Like, they're just like, this is beautiful, Chanel. Like, this is amazing. And I'm pretty private with my work, so for it to be exposed in that way and to be seen and like given life, and for it to be received by my family that way, it gave me like a newfound sense of confidence and kind of like freeing myself. I don't know, it's just liberating on multiple fronts. And then they heard the messaging behind the work, and then they were so flattered. My grandmothers were just amazed that I even wanted to do something dedicated to our history, only because I just feel like once they migrated to California and, you know, had my parents, and then consequently I came about, it's like no one was thinking about the South. It's like we're from California, like this is our life. So for me to like be interested in the before, it
Mhm.
was just healing on multiple fronts for the family. And then like parsing through a lot of the archival photos to see those pictures of them in the South, things like that. It was just a learning experience, and just learning so much. So I feel like the women in my family are natural teachers too, so it's just a full circle moment, truly.
It's incredible that, these works that, you work in self-portraiture, and as you're talking, so much of the work, I think I'm thinking specifically about the platform installation with all of the plants that was inspired by your grandmother's gardens. And in a way, they're also even though these are self-portraits, they're ultimately also portraits of these women in your family as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm saying. It's like this idea of building off the archives.
Mhm.
A lot of my work is influenced by the image makers in my family, which are the women, my grandmothers. The camera kind of floated around people, but they were the ones that like took some of the majority of the images, but also the ones that like culled them together and put them in some
Mhm.
sort of archive. So just looking at that, like the pictures, those portraits of them and how they own their identity as women through self-portrait, not necessarily self-portraiture, but like portraits of them. I was able to do something similar, but now it's self-portraiture. Like I'm the one making the image and like controlling the way in which I want to be represented and seen. So it's always building off of something before me and keeping the archive alive in that sense.
I'm gonna stop the share for a moment just because I want to look at another image in particular, specifically the one that was in the SF Camera Work auction this past year, which was just incredible. So I'm gonna share my screen again to
Sure.
look at this one.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
It's just such an arresting, beautifully visually arresting image. And I didn't get a chance to, I didn't really get a chance to ask you questions about this particular work at that time, so it now seems like a great time. Who are the women in this image? Are these members of your family? Were these models?
They're models. They're people I just reached out to make the image. Sometimes I'll source sitters that I just meet in passing. It's not always familial based. So this work is actually from an my archive, really. It's some work I was making before the Natura Negra series, and I had never really showed it. So I decided to bring it into light. So this image is called Seraphim, which is basically like one of the highest orders of angels, in, like religious like iconography and things like that. And I just called it that because the women are in white. White is a reoccurring color in my work, and just showing this idea of like light, not necessarily purity in like the Christianity sense of the word, but just more so light, time, life force, things of that nature, a pureness of one's light. And I just want to show Black women portrayed in this soft way. It's like calling to this idea of sisterhood, all three of them together, sort of like a Trinity-like composition too, with the three of them. And I really want to emphasize their skin. So, punching up that contrast a bit to really bring out the vibrancy of like beautiful Black skin and just contrasting against the white. It was definitely something that was intentionally done. And then, one of the women is like looking directly at me. It's kind of like breaking that like third wall or whatever, like where you're acknowledging the camera and while the other ones are looking away. And just really showing this idea of like how making images of a person is collaborative, or it's intimate, it's an exchange. I don't feel like I'm taking photos. It's like I'm making a photo of you, and I'm very deliberate with that language. And these women are my sitters. They agreed to sit for me. They're not my subjects. It's just very conscious of that. But yeah, if you have additional questions about it, I feel free to answer it.
Well, I think so. The theme for the auction this past year, "See How Beautiful I Am," obviously is a very, just on its own, is kind of a moving phrase. But thinking about this photograph in relation to that theme, especially, I think is so. They just come together so perfectly. I think something that's really beautiful about this image in particular is that all three women, you can tell, have different skin tones. They have different skin textures, and all of that is on display at the same time. And none of it's competing. It's all like the skill of a photographer to be able to capture those nuances and complexities of Black skin is something that we still have struggle with seeing in photography today. And I guess these aren't so much questions, obviously, as I'm just like elaborating what I see in this image, but I'm just wondering if that was all, I mean, I'm certain it was deliberate in a way, but if you could talk about, I guess, how selecting this image in particular while thinking about the theme of the auction and thinking about just the racial reckoning of the past year as well, and where photography still has to go in terms of reckoning with itself.
Yeah, so in terms of the theme, like how I related to like see how beautiful I am, it's these women, they're not necessarily smiling or, doing anything theatrical. They're just sitting. It's like something like an everyday pose, but it's just showing this gentleness present. And like I said, really emphasizing their Blackness. Like, yes, they are all different skin tones, textures, things of that nature, but there's kind of like equalized with the way I underexpose the image to highlight that. And that's something I do in the work too. I'm very conscious of like representation. It's just so important to me, just based on like how I grew up with like images of Black women in the media. It seemed like one certain type was exalted over the other, and I personally push back against all that and just want to show the spectrum. Black beauty isn't a monolith. It's not, Eurocentric or, like I said, a one size fits all. It's like each of these women looks so different, and I really want to show that. in terms of representation, like I mentioned, I mean, that's how I feel like it relates to where photography still needs to go, especially with all that happened in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests, senseless murders of unarmed Black folks, both just of all spectrums, men, women, trans people, everything. It was just madness. And the equalizer was that they were all Black. It didn't matter. It didn't matter the differences between them. It was just, that's just racism. That's how racism works. So just building on this representation and showing different depictions of Black people that move away from ideas of tropes, stereotypes. And I'm very conscious to not fall into like racial tropes in my own work. I think it's so easy to do because we've been fed this imagery for so long. You start regurgitating it without even realizing it. So I'm very conscious to just pull back. I photograph people the way I would want to be photographed. That's really how I look at it. So it's like I'm making an image of you and seeing you as if you were me, and like how would I want to be depicted? It's all of those things. I feel like there was another part of your question I might have skipped.
No, it's okay. This is great.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit earlier about though, using your own body in a lot of your work, but being a stand-in for larger concepts and for larger ideas. And obviously with this work, this idea of seraphim, this realm of the angels, what are some of the other, what are some of the other themes or archetypes, not tropes, but archetypes that you are intentionally building into the narratives in your work? Are there any recurring kind of figures that appear as you're thinking about your photographs?
Yeah, maybe subconsciously. I'm not necessarily thinking of anyone in particular. It's just an embodiment that happens when I'm making the work. Like even the poses, the stance, the clothing, it's literally kind of in that moment. I'm not necessarily like using a reference, like this is who I'm watching channel and then I do it. It happens on its own, but as far as an archetype I can think of is like kind of like this idea of the matriarch, just really, it's really big in the Black community as it is. It's just the power of like the Black woman themselves and like being this matriarch, maybe being this container of like culture and like the preserver of culture and just kind of embodying that, like
and the producer of it as well.
Say that again?
And the producer of it as well. Not only obviously the contributions Black women make to all realms of the arts and culture in general, but also as literal vessels for more Black life, like the producer of,
Yes, I'm looking at that. So it's like just embodying that archetype itself was like, I don't know, this idea of like the beginning, like something primordial, the predecessor, things of that nature. Like I said, I'm always looking for an origin and like where does it start? And I just think about the matriarchs in my own family. And it kind of starts there. Like I said, they're the ones that have preserved our stories, our narratives. They're the ones that know everything and just kind of like embodying a bit of that if I'm able to. Yeah, and what was the other part of your question? I'm sorry. So that was
that was the whole question, really. Yeah. So in that, that was a question about archetypes, but who are some of your influences? Who are either photographers or other artists, or who do you look to as inspiration driving your work?
Carrie Mae Weems, Lorna Simpson, the works of Toni Morrison, Sadia Hartman, some of the words of James Baldwin even. It varies. And then there's works from photographers like Leslie Hewitt that are doing something totally different from what I'm doing, but I'm influenced by it. A lot of like Black female image makers, truly. I just build off of that. But Lorna Simpson and Carrie Mae Weems in particular, being self-portrait, they've done a lot of self-portraiture. I feel like I'm picking up from that lineage of that form of making, and just navigating this thing of what does it mean to be a sitter and a seer, meaning like I am the sitter I'm the person in the picture, but that I'm also the seer, I'm the photographer, I'm making this image of me. It's usually, my process is very intimate. It's usually just me, tripod, and the camera.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I will have an assistant to take the shot for me if the camera doesn't have some sort of timer capability, but I'm very deliberate on how I want it, just in full control. But that paradox of like, what does it mean to be moving between these things, and like this idea of statelessness and belonging, meaning where is home? Like I said, we're kind of like always shifting through our migratory patterns in America, like, and then beyond that, we don't really know where we're from outside of America. It's so speculative. And just navigating that statelessness, and like I said, like, where is a sense of belonging for us? Like, what does it mean to be this displaced people group historically in America? Just really unpacking all of those things. So they're themes that I think I'm like thinking about when I'm making the work, like I just mentioned, that all influence it, along with the artists that I just listed.
Do you look to De Carava at all in terms of, thinking specifically about also your use of the camera in urban social space and the way that you kind of approach photographing the city? I mean, obviously very differently still than him, but I think I don't know, there feels like there's a connection, like a lineage in a way, that a line you could draw between.
Definitely. I love De Carava's use of like intentional underexposure, where it just becomes almost, some images are almost completely black and you have to look closely to see the subject. Definitely a huge influence. I like this idea of playing with the gradients and tonalities within black and white photography. I feel like, because I'm not using color, it's like the gradations of those tones really matter, especially with conveying certain meanings. So yeah, De Carava is a huge influence when it comes to that. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, especially in some of the landscape portraits where it's really dark. Definitely, and like highlighting that skin, punching it up, like almost exaggerating it in a sense. Definitely something I've taken from De Carava.
You were talking about earlier, when we were talking about the residency, being able to have access to the dark room and being able to play around in there again. Have you been trying out different techniques, new techniques, in any of your work?
Yeah, more so just playing with the underexposure, just like leaving the light on longer on the photo paper to intentionally make it darker, and seeing what I can make within this contrast and different variants like that. I haven't done anything like entirely experimental, like something newer, but just more so moving away from conventions of like, this is how you make a properly exposed print, and intentionally going against that to see what I can come up with. So that's been great. Also just retraining those muscles, like being in the dark room. But I've been itching to do it because I shoot primarily on film. So my work is done in analog fashion. I typically print digitally, just for scale reasons and economic constraints. But to go back into just like the tactileness of it, like a full analog process, it's so much fun. It's something that I would love to continue moving forward. Like, what would it look like to make a large scale gelatin silver print versus just an archival pigment print? So these are things that retraining that muscle to get used to think about.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share now. I think it's probably a good time to move into, we have quite a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'm gonna just transition into, into the Q&A now.
Sure.
So a few comments from Facebook that Dimitri dropped in the chat. One person says, this reminds me of the Christian Cooper story, just the entitlement to that natural space of Central Park and the disparity in the women's perception of who belonged there and who deserved to be safe there. Yeah. That is something I was also thinking about as you were talking about access and the idea of being safe in public space, as a Black person. And I think that comes up a lot as well, even just thinking about COVID and thinking about who is able to be safe considering how many people in these very densely packed cities, Black people are some of the have some of the highest infection rates, the highest death rates. There's so much that is like a threat to us in space, and yet there's so much healing that also happens outdoors as well.
Yeah, thinking about that, that's what I was saying. Like last year during 2020, I didn't make very many self-portraits outdoors. When I did experiment with that, it was just like so radical to just be outside at that time. And then feeling policed by non-Black passerbyers that are just like looking like, what are you doing? You know, this idea of like, I don't even feel like I'm free to make a picture. It's like someone could call the cops on me for doing this, and then who knows what that could look like. And it's like I was doing nothing wrong. I was well within like my rights, right? So yeah, I think about that. And ironically, with that story with Central Park, it's like Central Park was a Black community that got completely gutted and turned into a park, as these things often happen. Like being in LA, it's like whole neighborhoods are destroyed by the freeways that were plowed through. Like one of the first apartments that my grandparents moved to during the Great Migration in like the 50s in California, completely gone. We can't even find that. Freeway has taken over it. And, you know, I would never know. No one would never know it. You don't even think about it anymore. But I think about erasure, right? And that's something that I'm combating in the work is like Black erasure. And Black people have been systematically erased from any narrative of the landscape that isn't slavery related. And that's completely false. Like that's just not true. So I'm definitely looking at that too. So those things came to mind, like literally it got brought to light again because of COVID. But yeah, that's been in the work too.
Another question from Bria Hunter is, did it take you some time to decide what kind of art spoke to you while getting your BFA?
Yeah. What kind of art spoke to me while getting my BFA?
Yeah, did it take you some time to decide what kind of art spoke to you while getting your BFA?
Kind of. I kind of had an idea of like folks that I liked. Like I mentioned, Carrie Mae Weems, Lorna Simpson, Dina Lawson was someone also I really admired. So I kind of had an idea of like, these are things that I like, but learning that new language to make work in that way, that was like the learning curve, I feel like, where just moving away from a photo that's just aesthetically pleasing to a photo that has layered meaning, that is not something that happens straight away. That's like something you're learning to do, like metaphorically. So that was a huge process, I feel like. But no, I feel like I already kind of knew what I liked. Like I knew what I was aspiring to do. It was just learning how to do it.
The next question is, what do you want your viewers to take away from your work?
I want my viewers to have a reconciliation with nature, especially if they're Black looking at this. Like the land is for you. And regardless of who says you don't have like stake in it or you can't be here, it's like pushing back against that and challenging people to look into their archive, look at their histories to this land. We may be kind of like displaced or orphaned from a broader connection to the continent, for instance, like Africa. Like I said, it's speculative. Like we can kind of go back because there's, you know, blood work they can do now, but just connecting to what we know in the States, like finding out where you're from, I think it's like a full circle moment to know your identity, especially as a Black American, where it's so fraught and it's so fragmented as it is. I want people to do that and to see themselves as being able to access urban nature or just rural nature in general, seeing themselves in it, seeing themselves safe in the landscape. I think that's something like we never really think about. We don't feel safe. We feel like it's not, you know. I just want to dispel those myths and show a different narrative.
Next question is, for you, how important is content versus form, especially with your outside photos? Does one play stronger than the other?
No, I think it's working together because the content is all the things I was talking about in this talk, but the form is like what you saw visually. So they're both in my mind. I think in the beginning when I was working on this series, form kind of led the way. It's just I was attracted to these scenes. I started placing myself in them, not really knowing the full content, just more so an affinity towards something. And then I looked at what I was making and I was able to see what it was like. And then I developed a deeper understanding of it. So that's often the case, I feel like, with art making. It's like you don't always know initially the thing, but it reveals itself. But it's a delicate dance. But no, the two work in tandem, equally important at this point.
Next question from Amir Sadiq. You mentioned Toni Morrison as an influence. I think of her essay on memory and the archive. Do you ever consider that as you make images, it instantly becomes an archive, and how others may build on the archive you're creating?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I was saying with the work that I make. Is it's influenced by my familial archive from like the matriarchs of my family, like my great grandmother and my grandma, and looking at how they represented themselves through portraiture. It wasn't self-portraiture, but they were really deliberate with how they presented themselves in photos that they held onto that became our storyline. And by me doing that, it's like I took it a step further. It's like, okay, now I'm the one making the image of me and inserting myself in this deeper conversation where it really comes back to empowerment, I feel like, and like kind of like rebuking like patriarchal authority in a sense and just owning like what it means to be a Black woman and owning that power in that. So definitely. And by being influenced by that, it's keeping the archive alive, keeping it moving, breathing, and just constantly building. And like I said earlier, all work is kind of built off of our archive, be it familial or personal as an artist. Everything is influenced from the past. And yes, with photography, it is a unique medium where as soon as you make the image, it's already in the past. So it's like this weird perception of how time moves with photo. And I heard someone once describe like if you were to look at all the photos that you made and like all the seconds, like those photos were literally just seconds, like how much time would that really have even been? Like maybe it accumulates to like a minute's worth of like time, but like, I don't know, it's just so interesting how the two kind of like speak to each other when making the work.
One of the other questions ties in nicely is how does your work speak to historical images? So this one is also about the archive. They also asked you directly address the archive in your work, which you have said, but how does your work speak to historical images?
Yeah, I'm looking at the historical images present within my own family archive, but then I noticed like through lines with other archives that I looked at of like these reoccurring pictures that seem to be existing. For instance, there's a lot of portraits, or a couple, I should say, of my grandmother in the studio in the South. It's kind of reminiscent of this show that the Met put on, where it was these studio portraits that someone acquired from an archive from various places in the South. So these were taken in Texas, but it showed them in front of this backdrop of like nature, but it was like palm trees and things that weren't necessarily common for the landscape they were in Texas, but it was like aspirational, like this is this thing we're ascending to. And that was connected to the fact that those portraits were literally made shortly before they migrated to California. It's like this idea of like in their clothes, like what they're wearing. It's like Sunday's best, like presenting yourself in this light. And I feel like I carry things on like that in the work based on the clothing which I'm wearing, the scenes in which it's made. I'm taking it out of the studio and placing it in the land versus like this facsimile of nature. And this like disconnect there. It's really rooting it back in. And then beyond that, as you mentioned, Elena, like I reminded you of the picture of Venus. Mm-hmm. Well, there's one that I came to know called The Birth of the Sable Venus. And I feel like that's definitely more in line with the work versus like Botticelli's Venus, which is like a white woman in this way. The Birth of the Sable Venus is a Black woman standing in a similar pose above the Atlantic. It like speaks to the transatlantic slave trade and different things. So I feel like I'm embodying that in the work. I am influenced by imagery like that. And then I'm pushing back against imagery that I was fed through K through 12, which is like images of Black people hanging from trees, burned at the stake, terror in the landscape. I'm purposely creating images that have nothing to do with that as a way to reconcile, not to erase or to, not acknowledge the history, but to tell a different to bring to light a different perspective, only because I feel like there's so much there that we're missing in our understanding of ourselves because we've been scared or like scared away from it. It's just like a way to renegotiate all of those things and to learn more about ourselves.
With that in mind, because obviously so many with Natura Negra, these images of trees, of leaves, of grass, of plants, but I wonder, have you considered at all, or are you interested at all in explorations of water? Just thinking about exactly as you're saying, in this relationship to kind of like the flora and fauna nature, but also this kind of reconciling of our relationships with the transatlantic slave trade, our relationships with the power and destruction, but also giving force of bodies of water as well. Thinking about hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, thinking about the swamplands of Louisiana, thinking about the Gullah Islands, things like that. I don't know, is that something you've ever considered for your work?
It's something that's come to mind, but I think I was more so fixated on the land versus an emphasis on the water, because there's so much of this terrain, like the whole landscapes of America, like the various ones that we just don't know. So I think I've been fixated on like investigating what's here on the soil, quite literally, and looking at the different plants of these regions and like what are the metaphors of these different, like you said, the different flora and things like that. I think there will come a time when I start investigating water, only because that's such a strong metaphor for us in various capacities. But at the current iteration, it isn't the primary focus. But yeah, nonetheless, if I were to focus on a body of water that's interesting to me, it's like the Mississippi River and things like that. What does it look like? The bodies of water that exist within the states that were instrumental in like escaping slavery and different things like of that nature. So yeah, it's on my mind, definitely.
Yeah. So I'll go back to the Q&A questions now that I've interrupted. Why do you think it's especially important for Black folks to tell their own stories?
Oh, because it's a way we can arrive at the truth. I feel like when it's not us telling the story, it's someone's perception of us that is usually skewed, limited, imagined. It's just not nuanced. It's lacking nuance. And I feel like it's important for us to tell our story so that we get a fuller picture of who we are as a people. I just think about the media I ingested as a child to like a young adult, like in movies, magazines, TV. It was always through, more times than not, it was through someone else's perspective of us. And like, how damaging was that to see myself through someone else's eyes and these tropes? That's when you get these racial tropes, these stereotypes, these archetypes that are like inherently racist. And then you start internalizing that and believing this is all you can be. But this is someone that knows nothing of the culture. They're just further perpetuating this same narrative. It's just like, no, it's so important, like I said, to just really bring it back to center, like who we are truly. And that can only be done if we're the ones behind the camera, behind our words, controlling our narrative. Just so essential more than ever, I feel like, as things keep happening politically. It's just imperative.
So the next question is, how does Black Lives Matter impact your work?
Black Lives Matter impacts my work 100%. I'm very passionate about it. Just the influence of the movement. I just remember vividly in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed. And then in 2013, that's when we kind of got first wave Black Lives Matter. Like there was various waves of it. It kind of started in 2013. And then it came back around 2015 before Trump was elected that fall. And then it came again, like full force in 2020, pretty much the largest it's ever been. It was global at that point and just everywhere. But if you take it back to 2013 when I started, I was around the age of 21, I think, like 21 or 22, really young. And that just shifted my whole perspective. Like, I feel like growing up in California, there's this thing that happens when you're gaslit about racism. You can be experiencing it happening, it's happening to you, but something in you like makes you double think yourself, like, well, did I experience it? It's just covert. It's very, very layered. So when that happened and was brought to the forefront, it just opened my eyes to like racism is still alive and well. You know, I feel like there was this period in like the early 2000s to like the beginning of the 2010s where it's like, oh, racism is over. Like, especially if you're in California, like, what do you mean? No, it was alive and well. So that kind of like sparked this thing where I was like diving into my Blackness more. And then it just kept growing. So when 2015 hit, I made the conscious decision to almost exclusively photograph Black people in my work because I was pushing back against this Eurocentric framework I had been fed forever. And like I said, going back to the previous question, depictions that were fed to me from non-Black people about me. And it's like, I just think about the work that's coming out now. Ever since 2015 onward, you see so much representation from like TV to movies to cinema to just magazines and imagery. Photography had a renaissance where there's like so many Black photographers working now, and we're getting these nuanced depictions. That is so essential because I think about when that didn't exist literally 5-6 years ago, and how like that just what it does to your subconscious. So yeah, Black Lives Matter just like sent me there to really make that the forefront. Representation, deliberate representation and control of one's narrative to put something out there that is an alternative view. I feel like that's like an artist's responsibility, to be honest. Like if you're just perpetuating the same trope, what are you doing to move the needle forward? How are you trying to change the conversation? Are you just comfortable with this monolith? And that's what I'm doing, is like dispelling the monolith. Like something as simple as depicting a Black person in nature. That's radical. It's like that act is radical because it had never been seen. Like, maybe it has, but not in this way. And I just think we need to tell these alternative narratives. It's a responsibility.
The next question is, why Black and white?
I photograph in Black and white because I like how it's very stripped down. It has a sense of like timelessness to it. You can kind of place it in a different time because of that stripping down of the color, and also the clothing. Like it kind of looks like it can be the 90s or it can be present. It's not really rooted in time and space in that way, and I like that. I just feel like that's further emphasized with using Black and white. And also just thinking about the lineage of photography, like how it started in Black and white, and kind of like inserting myself into that conversation. Where it's like I'm speaking this traditional language, but subverting it at the same time, and like showing something, showing a narrative that isn't like traditional depictions. But yeah, it's definitely influencing me in more ways than one. And you know, the fun fact is, for a while, I was really against Black and white photography. I felt like it was restrictive. Like I was like, I want to shoot color. Like I don't want to do Black and white. Like going through school and learning photography, they make you start with that. It's like the basics. And I just wanted to move away from it. I thought I was past it. But in undergrad, I kind of had to retake a class that was Black and white, medium format Black and white. And somehow I fell in love with it. It was really strange, even to me. Like why I stuck with it. It just, and like I said, for those reasons that were unbeknownst to me at the time, but revealed themselves later as to why I'm so attracted to it. But yeah, yeah.
Next question is, how do you feel photography has further connected you to your family, ancestors, truth?
Just because I'm investigating my identity, and in turn my familial identity. A lot of the current work that I'm working on is looking at this archive. I've inherited huge treasure trove of images that are barely like a quarter of what my grandparents have. And by me investigating and asking questions like, who is this? Where was this taken? And like listening to these narratives and doing my best to take notes and record what I can. I'm very fortunate to have my great grandmother still alive. She's going to be 94 this month.
Wow, so, congratulations.
Yeah, she knows everything, and she's like happy to talk about it. So like I said, I think I'm the only one in the family, like out of my parents or like the grandkids, that is actually invested in knowing the history. I feel like there's always one person in the family that wants to know. So that's how we've gotten deeper with it, because I'm just wanting to literally know like their life's narration. Like tell me about us. Like where do we come from? And that has been very healing in that regard.
I want to give you the opportunity to plug anything you may or have coming up next this year. Any shows, any books, any residencies, any projects?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I have a issue of Matte magazine coming out this spring,
Oh,
and
nice.
it's an independent publication in which each issue is dedicated to a single photographer. So it's like a wide selection of images from this series that just haven't been shown. Most of the images that currently exist online from this body of work are maybe like a solid 10 or something like this, but this issue is about, I don't know, maybe like 30 images or something. So it's like more expanded on the series. That will be, able to be viewed on my website, things of that nature, to be able to purchase a copy of that. And in the spring, I'll be showing in New York at Fotografiska in a group show there. That will be sometime in March, where that is available to the public. I'm so excited about that, to be showing
Yeah,
in New York, especially since a lot of the work was made in New York. It's like a nice
yeah.
homecoming for that body of work. I'm trying to think some other things. So many things just kind of like happen.
Mhm.
It's We will see. I feel like there might be something else that I may be missing. Other than that, just like life update. I'm in the process of applying to grad schools. So I'll be getting grad school in the fall and continuing on with my photography, just taking it to that next level of investigation. So yeah, things are changing, things are shifting. It's kind of been forward momentum since the show with MoAD last year, which I'm incredibly grateful for. Just having my work on a platform like this to be seen, and to quote Viola Davis, who I love Viola Davis. She has a quote. This isn't verbatim, but she has said that the only thing separating like Black women from success is just access. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And like through showing at MoAD, that was access. That gave me an opportunity to be seen. And like I feel like so many Black artists, that's the missing component. Like we're here, we're ready. It's just about being seen. So I'm just, incredibly thankful. Like I said, extreme gratitude. Because of that, things have just kept going, and it's just forward momentum from here.
I want to circle back to, I mean, to what you're saying now, but also kind of what you were saying in the beginning about the beginning of quarantine, of reaching out to your community and asking for help. I think this is a question that, for me as a museum worker, but also someone who's involved in the arts community, I think it's something that's been very present of mine for me recently. Is just like, what are ways that we can continue to step up and support emerging artists at this period of time? Like, what are ways that the museum can continue to be a a vessel or vehicle for your growth as well? I mean,
Yeah,
just like, how can we as like an arts community continue to create that access and be that asset to you and to other emerging artists?
I think grants are a great way. That was something that was revealed in 2020. Grants were coming out of the woodworks. All of a sudden, all this money appeared in the arts when it was often said that there was no money available. It's like that just showed it's been here. Why has this not been available to artists the whole time? A lot
Mm-hmm.
of artists, like myself, like at that time, it's like we're struggling just to like put food on the table, quite literally, and pay my rent just to be here. Um, and that's just not sustainable living that way. And it's like living in those conditions, yet the general populace is still expecting you to produce and do all these things and be this machine. But it's like I can barely like survive, doing these things. It's like these grants should always be available. And it doesn't matter the size. Like I applied to just so many. It adds up after a while, but that should be a constant. I really hope that grants for artists don't disappear after COVID is over and we assimilate back into our new normal, whatever that may be when we return into person. That needs to stay a constant,
Mm-hmm.
and mutual aid funds, which I was very fortunate to be awarded one from an organization in Oakland called Critical Resistance. And that was great. That came at like a really pivotal time And the way the mutual aid funds work is like you give something back. So like you receive it. It's not a grant where you just walk away with it. It's like you put a portion of it back. So this idea of like reciprocity, like even if it's mutual aid, it's like take from the well, replenish the well, and just keep doing that. If that's what it takes to keep it sustainable, that should be done. I think of things like the Black Space residency that I'm a part of, and how that provided access to space to be able to work and resources and small stipend to be able to navigate in such a way. That is essential. Just providing access and actual like capital for artists, essential. That is literally what kept me afloat and is continuing to keep me afloat are the artist grants. To be quite honest, I'm not working full time right now. The situation with COVID is still up in the air for a lot of people. And that is how I'm sustaining myself. So it's like a lot of artists like me in those positions where we're talented, capable, and here, but like you need a little help, you know? So that's kind of what I believe could be done from museums and other institutions, keep these grants happening, or establishing mutual aid funds. But I'm incredibly grateful to my community, like just the family that I've made here in the Bay, because those are the ones that came through for me, which was just so humbling, and that's why I'm here right now.
Well, everyone at MoAD is incredibly grateful for you being part of our family. And this has been such an incredible conversation today. I'm so glad that you took the time to be on the program this week, and obviously to continue to see your success and where you go next. And it's been lovely to kind of look back on your exhibition. It was the last good time I feel like many of us had before everything happened in 2020. So it's been nice to kind of, it feels nice to like send it off in a way, a nice like anniversary kind of
yes.
moment.
Yes, definitely. And I hope folks continue to donate to MoAD to be able to keep programs like that. Like it's definitely essential, and it really does change one's whole like trajectory. You know, it's a very important project. So for those listening, you know,
Yeah.
MoAD, it's just amazing. So I appreciate it. I appreciate this conversation, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Elena.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for watching the program. You can, if you want to watch this program or any of our previous, you can always see this on our YouTube channel. Feel free, please spread the word, tell everyone. The next, we'll have another in the Artist Studio in 2 weeks. So stay tuned to see more information about that. It was so great talking to you, Chanell. It's always great talking. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And we'll see you at the next one.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.